Hi Idara, this is Lauren from Zephyr Astrology on Etsy. Thank you so much for coming back and wanting to do another look through at your Saturn return. I really sincerely apologize that the first reading didn't dive into the concepts maybe with enough depth, or like I always assume, I just rambled and things got really convoluted, and we ended up missing some of the essential points, which is definitely a character flaw of mine. So hopefully I will be able to just flesh these out a little bit more for you, because my goal as a reader is to definitely make sure that astrology is easy to understand and conceptualize for people, and it doesn't have to be this big complicated process, although oftentimes with astrology it really is. But hopefully the way that I am able to break this down with the visual attached to it will just help maybe for things to just stick a little bit better. So I do sincerely apologize, and I actually really appreciate the feedback because this allows me to go back to the Saturn return template as I have it and make some adjustments, because it probably is complicated for other people too, and they just didn't come forward and say, hey, I didn't understand this. So I have the tendency to think that, there are certain concepts in astrology that are just like easily known by everybody, and they're really not. They're complicated subjects. So hopefully this reading will help to just clear things up. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. So here you can see your chart, right? And so this is probably how you view your chart on whatever app or whatever web browser for astrological services that you use. So whether that's astro.com, the Pattern, CoStar, Astromatrix, whatever, there's tons of them now, and they are very, very helpful. So you have probably known a lot of the basic positionings and concepts of your natal chart at this point. And I'm going to assume that you have a lot of the basic concepts of Saturn down and understood. So here is how I was intending to address Saturn, looking at it through two different viewpoints, because Saturn will have an overarching impact in your pragmatic and mundane life. So you'll have a lot of the external circumstances of Saturn, like how things will play out in the world around you, versus how Saturn impacts you personally and psychologically. So what we have here is your like modern chart casting. So classical astrologers use charts that looked quite different than this, but the modern approach is definitely leaning more towards the psychological understanding, and it's a little bit more of a spiritual take on an astrological chart. So again, when I'm using some services that rely more on external influences, I will not typically use this chart. And so for the Saturn return reading, I use both of the major chart styles that we're going to talk about today. So this is your modern chart casting, and we can see that Saturn is in Pisces here. And it's in your second house with the way your chart casting is. And this is based on, your geographic location of being in Houston, Texas. Now, technically all chart castings are based on your geographic location, but the division of the houses that you see here, so see how like the first house and the second house and the third house even are much larger than the fourth, fifth, and sixth houses. This is, pretty common if you live in the northern hemisphere. So when you live in the States, typically charts like this look pretty common. And so we see that Saturn is on its own in the second house, and it's in the sign of Pisces in this chart. So when I was talking about some of the initial concepts of Saturn, I was speaking in terms of your personal understanding and your personal confrontation realistically with Saturn. So again, just to kind of really briefly review those basic concepts of Saturn and the basic concept of the Saturn return, is that Saturn, where it's positioned in your life, is going to speak a lot about where you feel maybe insecure, where you feel limited, or where you feel there's a strong sense of duty, or what area of your life you feel you have to put a ton of work into, like what circumstances you feel you might have to rise above. This can oftentimes be a house where we face the most obstacles in our life. So a lot of times as an astrologer can really kind of make some pretty bold statements about an individual just by looking at the sign in the house position that Saturn is in their chart. So we see here with Saturn in the second house, we talked about how the second house deals a lot with values and appraisals. So oftentimes we get this immediate sort of description of the second house being the house of finances. And that's more of the, again, the external factor that relates to the second house. It deals with possessions, finances, assets. It also generally will make a statement on how you make money, right? And so there's also this psychological aspect and this spiritual aspect to the second house that talks about self-understanding and talks about how we value ourselves or how we perceive ourselves, our self-evaluation. And this is because we're coming off of the first house, which is just more of like our baseline energy and physiology. So this talks a lot about our basic descriptors or like basic things that someone could perceive about us or that we perceive about ourselves, and talks about how we see ourselves when we are entering into the world and going into different environments. Like what is sort of that variable of how we behave or carry ourselves, right? So it talks a lot about our general presentation. So the second house is, okay, so there's me with the house of self. And then the second house is like, okay, and this is what I bring to the table, or this is how I'm valuable, right? And so when Saturn is in the second house, there can be this psychological implication that there is some sense of insecurity, limitation, or obstacle related to either one's, and oftentimes it's both, related to either one's finances, how they make money, maybe like how they view, being like poverty or feeling impoverished or feeling wealthy, right? Like just how someone conceptualizes those ideas, as well as maybe like how someone views themselves or like how someone comes to understand themselves. So this can show that you can come to understand yourself through hardships, right? Or through your limitations is how you come to understand yourself or how you come to evaluate yourself. And Saturn oftentimes is a difficult planet to work with because it's malefic in nature. So malefic planets mean that they are seen through the lens of challenge or opposition or adversity versus seeing through the lens of allyship or support. So there is something being called into question in your life where you feel simultaneously a sense of restriction here and a sense of not of being quite challenged in this area, but you also feel probably a strong determination to overcome some of these limitations. And oftentimes on a very subconscious level, as I mentioned earlier, this can deal with insecurity, right? So this can deal with like where we don't feel super confident or where we don't feel like we have all the faculties or resources to our benefit. And that's another thing about the second house. The second house can be resources. So oftentimes people who have Saturn in the second house can have a very difficult lifetime of their relationship with money, their relationship with possessions and assets, their relationship with having available resources. And sometimes this can oftentimes depict somebody having like maybe a pessimistic self-evaluation of themselves. And understanding too, not only Saturn as a general concept and Saturn in the second house, understanding Saturn in Pisces. So this talks about the type of expression that is being repressed or limited in some way. So this is a type of sign expression that maybe doesn't come the easiest to you, or the concepts of the associations that Pisces oversees. There can be a difficult relationship in how you express those things. Now, this is always very dependent on someone's chart, right? So Saturn is in a grand water trine here. So there is a chance that you can approach and work with this Saturn a little bit better, or it's more feasible for you versus maybe somebody who has like nothing connecting with Saturn here, okay? But there is this sense where maybe there is this limitation in how you're able to self-evaluate your creative attributes or in what ways maybe you have more liberal or artistic talents. Pisces also oftentimes rules sort of this very enigmatic energy dealing with faith, dealing with our intuition or our higher selves. So there can be a difficulty in finding value in some of these natural traits or natural skills that you have, because you have a planet in Pisces. So this tells us that you have the propensity to really lean into your potential in this area and really master the Pisces expression. But oftentimes this is something that will take a lifetime to do. And you are gaining some support from your moon, and you are gaining some support from Mercury with Saturn in your chart. So you might be somebody who maybe has a very pessimistic view of yourself, or maybe you have difficulties with like concepts of self-love or being self-acceptance, right? Or maybe you have concepts of maybe you find it difficult to see something as valuable unless there is some sort of evidence of its ability to contribute. And so you might not value more intangible expressions as you do tangible expressions. So that's something I see pretty commonly with Saturn in the second. But Saturn is connecting with your moon and Mercury. So this can show that generally speaking, you are somebody who can be very empathetic, and you do probably have a very controlled sense of emotions and how you maybe address other people. And you generally want to be helpful or want to contribute in some way in this world based on some of these limitations or based on some of these things that you have struggled with. There is a direct sort of desire here to want to bring something good out of that based on the moon and Cancer being in the 6th house. So this oftentimes, I see a connection like this, oftentimes relating to this idea that someone may be very hard on themselves, but very, very forgiving of other people. And so that's just something that I see commonly with associations like this. So as I mentioned, yeah, you got that Saturn here in the 2nd house. If we were to talk more about the spiritual implications and the karma of Saturn in Pisces, this could be that in a past life, possibly if you believe in reincarnation, in a past life, you really severely limited yourself in being able to explore concepts more in depth, and understanding that some of the spiritual and religious exploration is inherently helpful for understanding ourselves and helping us to identify ourselves. This could be that there's a possibility that you infringe on other people's ability to create sustainable lives for themselves and have a lifestyle they enjoy. And that maybe you had some sort of wealth in the past life, or you had a lot to be grateful for, but you weren't necessarily very gracious in that energy of abundance and prosperity. And so in this life, in some ways, you start off maybe being financially more compromised, or you start off with this natural insecurity. And the goal is to try to build that sense of grace and gratitude as you are going through life and going through life's transitions. So as you can see, when Saturn is relating with a certain sign and a certain house, there's a variety of associations that can come up for any individual. So even me talking to another person who also has Saturn in Pisces in the 2nd house, their Saturn return can manifest drastically different than what your Saturn return is going to manifest as. And so that is part of the reason that I go into the classical concepts of understanding Saturn, to kind of see where some of those outside markers, what areas of life that may impact. And then again, how can we relate those external events as impacting you on that personal psychological level, right? And so if I were sitting here with you in a live session, this would probably be a point where I would start asking some questions about, Saturn as it's played out in your life, right? And that can be, and another thing I'm kind of looking at in terms of the Saturn, and I think it's important because we do kind of need to address the other planets that Saturn is associating with, because it's always really important when we're looking at a Saturn return and understanding Saturn holistically, not just its stagnant, presentation of Saturn in the second in Pisces, but like understanding how it relates to the rest of the chart. So we can see that there could be a lot of emotional growth through Saturn transits, and there also could be a lot of intellectual growth and deeper comprehension and understanding through events that are being instilled through Saturn and some of Saturn's challenges in your lifetime. So there is this drive to, again, want to find some sense of emotional fulfillment or happiness through being of service to others, and maybe wanting to transcend in a way like some of your limits in terms of your value by maybe extensively expanding your knowledge or expanding your understanding of the world. And I see this concept oftentimes being like, I need to develop skills that are marketable so that I can be a contributing member of society and I can make an impact on the world at large. Because I don't want to live life where like I didn't have anything to like leave my mark. I didn't contribute in any way. So there can be a very deep insecurity there. What I think is also pretty important before I move to the classical view is that Saturn is also square these planets here in Sagittarius. So we see that primarily the square is primarily impacting particularly this Jupiter, which is really interesting. We'll get to that in a minute. It's also in orb enough to be impacting this Mars-Venus. So it's not really touching this Pluto here that's at what we call like a critical degree, but it is definitely touching the stellium of planets in Sag in the 11th house. And Venus and Mars in particular, and Jupiter because it's benefic, these are very personal planets. So these are planets that you are working with and that you probably personally identify with or relate to on a much deeper level than Saturn, because oftentimes we tend to resist Saturn. We tend to not really identify with this energy, or this is an energy that can feel like our shadow selves in a lot of ways. So when Saturn here is square Venus and Mars in Sagittarius in the 11th house, this can be a statement of the fact that you might attribute, or there might be some challenge, or there might be some rivalry between these energies. So Venus and Mars in the 11th house is oftentimes going to talk about how the manner in which you take action or follow through, and the manner in which you identify and associate your desires, and how you see yourself in terms of interpersonal relationships and just relationally, how you interact or engage with others in this lifetime is connected with this 11th house energy. And so Venus and Mars in the 11th house deals with groups. And so it can deal with friendships primarily. So typically in our younger years, this is going to encapsulate friendship quite a bit. As we get older, this talks more about like how we integrate into society generally as a whole. So this will oftentimes talk about what drives us to integrate into groups or integrate into society. So that's where we start getting some of the concepts of hopes and wishes or aspirations, right? So what I read this as, just on a psychological, modern, therapeutic astrology take, is that you can have a lot of big dreams or aspirations, because we got Jupiter there too, and Jupiter is one of your strongest planets in this chart. So we see that we have Jupiter here in Sagittarius. So this can be that you do have like maybe really grand creative ideas, or maybe you just have a very strong will to really kind of, again, leave a lasting mark or make an impact on the world. And some of your manner in which you're driven to do these things are by creating the right connections or relating with the right type of people, or finding some way to not only create that relational connection and understanding, but also by being driven physically and being very engaged in this area of life. So this can be just an area of life where you have a lot of focus, or you have a lot of your attention might go to this particular area of life. And there might be relative ease in this area of life as well, because Jupiter is so strongly configured here. So this tells me oftentimes that someone can have a very strong connection with their friendships and their peer groups, or they really, really put a lot of stock in how the world sees them, or they put a lot of stock in having affirmation from people outside of their immediate environment. So they want some sort of reception from the world or from society, generally speaking. And oftentimes this can be a very difficult thing to actually achieve, because oftentimes you're not going to be everybody's cup of tea in life. And so when I see configurations like this, I always get very worried on how that impacts somebody's self-worth. And we can see that Saturn is square all of these planets. So this can mean that through some of your insecurities, or through maybe a lack of self-worth or a lack of self-esteem, you find yourself driven or impulsively engaging in certain friendships, engaging in certain groups or associations, or maybe like chasing after certain dreams or certain aspirations in the hope that maybe you'll find some sort of value in yourself by getting this outside affirmation or by assimilating with an outside group in some way, right? And so like we can see that Saturn in some ways might be the seed of this drive. Or it can be the inverse, that you're naturally very inclined to be collaborative and you want to contribute, you want to share your ideas. Because I see Sagittarius as, it's one of the signs that's linked with knowledge, and it's linked with higher knowledge. So this can be that you feel like you can expand a lot of your worldly understanding by this ideal or ideology that inherently there are going to be other people in life that will have strengths that you don't possess. And so it's good for you to create these connections so that you can continually learn and absorb more. And that maybe in some ways you can continually develop your own skill set by being in association with other people who have these capabilities, right? And so we can see that you just might naturally be very inclined towards socializing or very inclined towards trying to lean into self-actualization, making your dreams a reality. But through some of this process, you've had hardships or you've had limitations or you've had, some sort of downfalls or negative windfalls in some way. And so that develops a core negative belief that you might be incapable on your own as an individual, or you're inherently not worthy, or your self-evaluation is weak because of your experiences in these spaces. And oftentimes this is probably going to come from very early experiences, right? Like where we start getting that negative core belief of Saturn. So it may be that you kind of always possessed that mindset, but it was through some of these experiences in the 11th house that some of that seed was planted. And it's very interesting because Jupiter is so strong here, but because it's square Saturn, in some ways you may not have a very rational or realistic view of your potential because of what Saturn is stating here. So there is this need with Pisces to be gentler, to be kinder, to have self-empathy, right? So I would just be very curious. And Saturn, oftentimes, it's a vocational planet, so it's a workplace planet. But it's also a planet that relates to like authority figures in our lives, right? So there could be that the self-esteem comes from some sort of authority figure in your past life as well. And that relationship might have felt quite challenging, so you lean into the friendships, right? Or you lean into creating connections outside of the family unit. And so that could be some of what that Saturn is stating as well. So that's really kind of doing a pretty good thorough breakdown of Saturn, right, in your natal chart. And so with that Saturn return, right, so talking about the Saturn return. So with the Saturn return, so this is your first one that you're going through. And we see that there's usually about like a 15-degree orb where we start to really feel Saturn. Saturn as a return generally started for you though. It was March 7th of 2023, but it probably won't really kind of like kick up until the end of this year. Or it actually might be starting to kick up now because Saturn is at, and I have my numbers here. So Saturn as of today is the 8th. is at 5 degrees. So yeah, we're probably like in orb of this, right? So you're probably really starting to feel this now, and you probably didn't feel much of Saturn's presence when we did the initial reading, and that might be why, as you've been feeling Saturn more and more, you might have wanted to come back to this reading and maybe like review it again, right? So that makes perfect sense. Again, as the Saturn return, this talks about a time in our life in which we are being challenged to take accountability. And it's where this very realistic lens like comes into view. And we're able to really spotlight ways in which in the past we didn't take accountability, we didn't do our due diligence, we weren't responsible. And we have to create a new relationship with this idea of responsibility, with this idea of duty. And so something about this needs to be addressed, because this ultimately is setting up what the next 27 to 30 year period of your life is going to entail. So when we really approach Saturn without fear, and we approach this idea of taking responsibility for ourselves in a balanced manner, and we are open to learning, and we're open to confronting some of these negative aspects about ourselves, we find that next cycle of Saturn is much easier, or it feels like we're not being quite so challenged. But because this is the first time we're really experiencing Saturn in such a bold, poignant manner in our lives, it can feel like we don't have any support, and it can feel like we're being really pushed to our limits. And what's important to know about Saturn and the Saturn return is that what you can do is, and I'm gonna show you this, is that you can take a look at how Saturn, where Saturn was when Saturn hit its other heavy aspects to Saturn. And that gives you some keys, or that gives you some clues as to how Saturn has been setting you up for this return. And I'm not sure if I went over this in your initial reading, but we're going to go over it now in the event that I didn't. So one of the first ones we'll look at is the last time Saturn was at 18 degrees and 4 minutes in your life. So that would have been, so you were born in 1995. So in June of 2002 was when Saturn was at your first Saturn square. Okay. So Saturn was transiting the 5th house of authentic self-expression. The 5th house is also the house of creativity. It's the house of like confronting who we actually are outside of the affirmation or the inclusion in other groups. It's kind of a way in which we can assess our talents or assess our passions in life. And so Saturn coming through here, and it was next to the sun as well, and the North Node, you might have discovered some sort of creative talent, or you might have discovered something that brings you a lot of joy, because this is also the house of good fortune, right? So you might have discovered something around this time that maybe brought you a lot of excitement, or brought you a sense of wonder, or like lit you up. But because Saturn is challenging, there might have been some sort of conflict with an authority figure, or there might have been, some sort of negative affirmation that like this was not accepted, or this was brushed aside or dismissed or put down. Now, again, it's all in relation to how you psychologically understand this. The actual events of what happened may not have been necessarily how you perceived it, but it's also really important to validate people's emotions and to, help people understand that, typically it is, it's a natural process of life, and both things simultaneously can be true. That you can feel at this time that you were you tried to maybe express some of your real self and felt like you weren't validated in that, and that was very hurtful and set up some of this Saturn narrative in your life. And also it can be true that maybe the adult figure in your life didn't have the intention of creating that type of mindset. So that's kind of dealing. So the Saturn square is talking about sort of like the first time it's really highlighting this Saturn narrative in your life. And generally speaking, this can be a pretty challenging time because we have limitation confronting limitation, right? And so that could be a narrative that was quite strong. And what's really interesting, and we'll talk about this in the classical because we start talking about dispositors, right? So Saturn is in the sign of Gemini, which is ruled by Mercury. So what you can actually do is look at your Mercury, and this could be another circuit of understanding maybe how the mindset developed, or like maybe how you refocused yourself from this challenge or this obstacle. So maybe if you were really expressing yourself creatively, or you were opening up and revealing something about yourself, and maybe that was challenged or dismissed, you might have leaned into, okay, that didn't get the type of response that I wanted. I'm going to try leaning into this energy instead, this Mercury energy, and maybe that was more well received, right? Especially because it's part of this like flowing grand trine, which means that these planets and their expression come easier to you than planets that have a lot of challenge to them, right? So then you can also look at, so that was your first Saturn square. So then what you can look at is the Saturn opposition. And so we can see that Saturn in its opposition happened October 26th of 2008. So that was going through your 8th house in the sign of Virgo, and that was opposed Saturn in the 2nd. And Uranus was on this as well. And when Uranus is on Saturn, this is a time where somebody feels like they need to break free of something. They feel really, really constrained and really restless. And they can be quite irritable at the time. So they can feel like they just need to somehow break away from convention or what has been. And so you might have really tried to test some of your boundaries at this time in some way. And you might have done this through the influence of somebody else, because the 8th house deals with others' resources. The 8th house, oftentimes when Saturn goes through here, this can be a time where someone really tries very hard to repress a certain energy that's inherent in their person and who they are. So this could have been, a time where maybe, again, it was signaled that you tried to grow and expand yourself outside of how you've maybe boxed yourself in, or how other authority figures have boxed you in. And that feeling probably felt really good because this Uranus is what we call sextile. So it's creating opportunity for you to lean more into your own identity at this time, right? And again, that might have been opposed, the opposition. It was opposed, it was challenged. And so therefore you might have just said, okay, you know what? Like, I've received enough negative affirmation about maybe really trying to grow this Saturn, and maybe trying to overcome this negative self-worth, right? Or maybe overcome my negative view about my valuation, or negative view about money, right? Like being impoverished in some way, feeling a sense of lack. And so this could have developed a narrative where like, I always need help or assistance from someone else, or I have to always be helping or assisting someone else to have true value. And I can't be self-serving, right? I can't like kind of focus on my own desires because that's somehow seen as negative. So there's always quite a few things that these things can translate as. And so that's one of the great things about when you get a reading like this, is like going back through your life and some of your circumstances and trying to understand what kind of happened around these times, because there will always be a pattern. Okay. There's always going to be a pattern in kind of what happened. And granted, these dates that I'm saying, it doesn't have to be these exact dates. It could be, 6 months before this, 6 months after this, because Saturn typically works in like a 15-degree orb at its widest. But I use like a 7-degree orb typically. So it probably happened sometime in this year of 2008, but this is when it was direct. So this is when the energy was at its strongest. So then looking at your last Saturn square, that would have been Saturn in Sagittarius. So here, and that would have been right on your Jupiter, right? So then you had Saturn in the 11th house. And again, the sun's always paired with that too, which I find is very interesting. So there is a pattern there that every time Saturn has had one of these heavy transits, the sun has been there to illuminate, to try to show you, right? So like there might have been a lot of external events happening at that time that directly impacted you. So we see that Saturn through the 11th house. So this happened back around December 3rd of 2016. And don't forget, and don't mind this place marker too much. It wouldn't be much different if we were using Houston, Texas, or using the area you were in at the time. So again, we see that Saturn is now in what we call the waning square. And so now as you are dealing with heavy Saturn transits, like you're starting to understand Saturn themes a little bit more consciously in our lives. Like usually that first Saturn square, we don't truly understand kind of like what we're experiencing or what's happening. But even for me, when I look back at like my Saturn transits, like I probably only really understood like that previous square before the return. And I was not practicing. I was just starting to practice astrology around this time. And then, so again, this is happening in that area of friendships, groups, assimilation with society, hopes, dreams, aspirations. And this deals in the 11th house deals with creation for the sake of others, where the 5th house is creation for the sake of oneself. So a lot of times, again, there's sort of this like theme of like, you know, how you contribute and how it serves or impacts others versus how you contribute and how that impacts you on an internal level or your immediate environment. Because this is the quadrant that deals with integration with one's environment. So this does tend to impact relationships that are close to us. But yeah, so that Saturn square in the 11th might have been some sort of negative circumstance that happened in relation to friendships, happened in relation to maybe like you assimilating with a workplace at large or with an association or a group. This can also sometimes the 11th house can span like religious communities as well. So there might have been some sort of like revelation about some of the limitations of this area. And you might have like really have begun to start understanding some of these squares to Saturn, how they impact you in your life. And how some of those limitations ultimately sort of like transpire, right? So that's kind of just talking about and breaking down like the times in which Saturn was really prominent. So again, I think that was 2002, 2008, and 2016, generally speaking, or 2017, depending, is kind of like when these major events would have occurred. So you can also go back through those times and kind of see what the patterns were. What I've done is like with what social media I have, like I went back and looked through like old social media. I didn't have diaries. I was never a diary person, which is a dang shame. But if you are a diary person, that's one of the best ways to kind of like see what was actually happening and to like transport yourself to that time. It's such a great way to be able to like really kind of like relive those moments and kind of tap into what you are actually feeling at those times. Whereas I don't have that type of resource because I just could never actually keep up with journaling. I bought so many journals in the attempt to like be a journaler and it was just not for me. I just could never stick with it. Okay, so really quickly talking about some of these classical concepts that I spoke about. So when we're talking about classical astrology, I pointed out before talking about like dispositors, right? So I talked about dispositors because this is a way of understanding energy transference in astrology. So when Saturn was going through your natal chart in Gemini, that was going to create a relationship with Mercury in your chart because Mercury always resonates or responds with the energies of Gemini and the energies of Virgo, because those are the two signs in classical astrology it rules, and in modern astrology it has the same rulership associations. So we can actually utilize this idea or this method of dispositors in classical astrology as well. So what we do typically in classical astrology is we're going to do either an equal sign or a whole sign chart. There are other ones too. Regiomontanus is another one, a meridian chart, equal sign. But I like to use whole sign. So we're going to use a whole sign chart. And one of the main concepts that I want to point out to you about understanding sect is understanding what planets are more productive or what planets gain a little more dominion in your chart based on what type of chart you hold versus what planets are going to be a little bit more challenging or a little bit more abrasive to work with. based on what type of chart you have. And one of the main reasons to understand sect for the natal chart is to understand what is your actual benefic planet and what is your actual malefic planet, because overarchingly in astrology, there are 2 planets classified as benefic planets, meaning they're helpful and supportive, and there's 2 planets that represent malefic planets that show challenge and opposition. Now, these planets generally will always show support and benefit or challenge or adversity in some way, because that's just how the planets work, right? That's just the lens that they typically play out through. But understanding in your chart whether Saturn, because oftentimes Saturn is seen as the greater malefic because it's the planet furthest from the sun and furthest from the earth. So there's more division of understanding between the planets and their expressions. However, with that being said, depending on what kind of chart somebody has, Saturn may be malefic in nature, but it might be more helpful or more conducive to support somebody in their journey based on whether you have a daytime chart, which is what's called a diurnal chart, or a nighttime chart, which is called a nocturnal chart. So the separation of planets and sect are if you have a daytime chart, meaning the sun is above the horizon, so it's like daytime when you were born, the sun imbues additional beneficial qualities to the planets of Jupiter and the planets of Saturn. If it is a nighttime chart, so like let's say we were to reverse this, so let's just say a good way of doing this is like if I put the 7th house, right, the 7th house on the ascendant, and let's say your sun is down here, right? So in that case, it's a nighttime chart, which means the moon gains dominion in your chart. And the moon is going to imbue these positive qualities and this little bit of a boost in the planets of Venus and Mars. So because you have a daytime chart, when it comes to talking about your Saturn return, with the Saturn return chart, when someone has a diurnal chart, it shows that Saturn, some of the obstacles and some of the challenges are going to be maybe more easily conceptualized or understood. And some of what Saturn will challenge you on, Saturn is like a little more patient, what is kind of like what I've noticed, or like Saturn kind of doesn't hit you out of the blue in the same way that Saturn would hit you out of the blue with a nighttime chart. And again, I think I spoke about this in the recording because I usually talk about sect very lightly, is that, you know, the sun imbues additional qualities with Jupiter and Saturn because their relations and like what they typically represent are associated more with daytime activities. So one of the big ones for Saturn is a vocation/career planet. So Saturn generally in mundane astrology rules things like commerce and rules things like industry and trade and you know, how the economy flows and, you know, how we are civilized, right? And so we tend to be more civilized. We tend to be more dutiful. We tend to like be like more aligned with like law and doctrine in the daytime versus at nighttime, we become maybe a little bit more primal sometimes, or we're more tired and fatigued in the evening because we sleep at night. So we're not as like apt to work. We're not as you know, we're not in a condition where maybe we can do hard labor, or we might not be in a condition where like all our faculties are available to us. So Saturn doesn't operate well in nighttime charts or nocturnal charts. So all of that is to say that typically if you have a daytime chart, the Saturn return is technically a little bit easier for people who have diurnal charts than people who have nocturnal charts. And like, again, some of the things that we'll see is that Saturn might just feel more combative to that person, or some of the challenges, the stakes are higher and there's more of a sense of urgency in terms of like having to address certain things. Whereas with Saturn in a daytime chart, you might have more time available to you. You might have more time to process what it is you're going through. And so that's generally going to be the case. So your greater malefic actually is Mars. So I have a daytime chart too. So it's Mars for me. And Mars is in my 7th house. And so one of the things that I had a lot of difficulty with in life is relationships, specifically relationships with men, right? Because Mars rules men. So I had a very difficult, for generally speaking, like lifetime of toxic relationships with men, or generally toxic relationships with people that wanted to assert some sense of dominance or control over me because Mars is the planet of war, right? And so that was something that I generally experienced in my life. Whereas Saturn, I always have had more time to kind of approach Saturn on my own timing at my own pace. So hopefully that's kind of like a good understanding of sect, and that's something that can be like understood from this point. So one of the main reasons I include that section is because, especially if someone has a nocturnal chart, it's kind of important to highlight and address the fact that they may not be consciously aware of Saturn in their life. Saturn might operate more unconsciously for them. And so it's really important that they do a lot of that introspective work to kind of like really understand just how Saturn has impacted them in their life, and understand maybe what those core negative belief sets are, or where they feel dutiful. They may not have even identified some of these things in their life yet. Whereas typically with a diurnal chart, you're going to see that a little bit more. They're going to be able to call upon those things a little bit easier. So we bring up this classical view because this is going to talk more about like some of the mundane manifestations that could happen during your Saturn return. Because this talks more about, what area of life Saturn actually has true rulership over, versus in the modern chart casting, this is more of your psychological understanding of Saturn and how it's impacted you in your life. So this is more like the objective view. Like if you step outside of yourself, like how would someone outside of you see maybe where you struggle, right? Or how would someone outside of you see, where you feel dutiful, or like, again, where you're challenged, or what your vocational strength really is, right? And that's kind of, and you'll find that what happens as well is that when you start looking at your chart in more of this whole sign, sometimes things make more sense in terms of like the external factor of how you integrate into the world around you. So how I look at my chart in a modern casting is not how I would look at my chart if I want to understand how to better control some of the influences that happen external from myself. So here we see that Saturn's actually in the third house. And so again, I'm kind of not surprised to see this because we understand that psychological core or seed is happening in the second house of self-worth. But what might have been some of the real actualized manifestations of Saturn and its negative impacts in your life might have been related to communication, early childhood experiences, so like typically school age experiences, or something that involves how you process, comprehend, or utilize knowledge and information, or how you communicate, or how you how you are able to engage with those around you rationally or intellectually, right? So we see that there is a Saturn challenge here. So, and this is also the house of siblings. So sometimes this could be a sibling relationship that someone has extensive trouble with. So we see that that's where the core of the Saturn return energy might transpire. So what oftentimes I see with Saturn in the third house is someone has to go back and sort of like review certain things, like in terms of how things transpired and how someone might have retained those things or come to understood those things is different than what the reality of those things were. And I keep talking about this basis of reality because Pisces as a sign tends to associate itself with the fantastical or the imaginary. So there is typically a concept of with Saturn and Pisces people that like how they perceive things or understand things just might be different. And that might be why they really lean into having some sort of evidence or having some sort of like control for how they receive information, because they're used to possibly getting like hoodwinked by believing somebody at face value, and that was that was something that typically presented in a negative outcome. So Saturn in Pisces in the third house. So again, this could be And a good example of this, because I never want to project it on, oh, it's all your fault, right? Because it can come off that way as I'm explaining it. So a really good understanding of this is like, because Saturn can oftentimes rule like a parental figure, typically the father as well. Like, let's say, someone had this belief all their life, and I'm just going to give an example. I'm not saying this is you, that they believe that their father was absent or not present because he just didn't want to be, right? And that was something that you were told of like very early in life, like maybe by your mom, and I'm speaking generally. And then you come to find out as you've been experiencing Saturn and sort of like understanding the concepts of father Saturn and authority and like becoming your own person with your own agency that has certain responsibilities, you maybe reflect on how some of those things were instilled from you in a past life, and you actually come to discover that the reasons you were given about this parental figure were actually not necessarily true. They were things where the narrative was somewhat twisted. And you actually come to find out that dad was absent because like, X, Y, and Z. Oh, and you have like a sibling you didn't know about. So like sometimes that can be like an external factor of like how Saturn presents itself. Like someone confronts their father that they were separated from for a long time. And with this, they gain new insight to beliefs they had very early in life. This can also be like if somebody, because Saturn, again, it's a vocational planet. So one of the basis of your career work could come through this conduit or expression of being involved in the communications field in some way, right? And you might have previously undervalued that skill. And so now as you are like really kind of entering in some of your golden years of career, because oftentimes that kind of happens from like our 30s to our 40s, you might realize the need to emphasize more of this particular type of energy and working with Saturn in Pisces in the third house, learning new information. So a lot of people go back to school and they learn a new trade. So back to school, like college is typically ninth house, but this could be like going into a new field altogether. This could be something is revealed to you and that kind of sets you off on a path to wanting to explore that a little bit more in your life. So there's a lot of different things that Saturn in the third can mean, but it's typically going to deal with short-term travel, siblings, communication, learnings that are new. And again, like your rational conversations with other people, like things that are not necessarily purely based in emotion. But we see that in classical astrology, Saturn rules the sign of Aquarius, and it rules the sign of Capricorn. So not only is Saturn getting some emphasis in the third house, we see that it's relating to the second house, which we were aware of, right? Like we were aware that Saturn is in your second house in your modern chart, and that's a lot of that psychological core. But now we also see that Saturn is bringing in some first house emphasis, and that's also bringing in the planets of Neptune and Uranus. And these planets have a connection with your moon, okay? So a lot of soul work is going to happen around this time. A lot being addressed from childhood could come up during this time. A lot of how you emotionally, give or sacrifice in relationships can come up during this time, because the axis of the first house and the seventh house is the relationship with myself and the relationship with others. And so the moon being very strong and configured in the seventh house can mean that it's very easy for you to be very giving and very generous and very emotionally available in relationships, where this concept of self-discovery and knowing yourself is a little more complicated, right? Because we have Neptune here, which is typically a planet of delusionment. So this can mean that you at times maybe don't really know who you are or don't know how to identify yourself. So how you identify yourself might come through how you contribute to the world or how you are seen emotionally and your emotional attachments with others, right? And so sometimes people who have configurations like this, their presentation changes based on who they're in a relationship with. A really good example of this is that my sister has a very similar pattern in her chart. And one thing I noticed is that with every long-term relationship she was with, her personality changed so drastically. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily going to be the case with you, but that pattern I see commonly. And so we also see Uranus here near the ascendant. So this can be that you, how you present yourself or how you identify can have swift changes. So one moment you might, connect with your self-identification in one way. And then, depending on the environment you're in or depending on what kind of challenge you're facing, you might view yourself differently. And so there is sort of this oscillation, or there is sort of this this little bit of a challenge or discord with like feeling very secure in your identity. And this security in your identity links back to third house and second house energies. So we can see that some of the manifestations of external factors in the Saturn return are going to relate to your money and finances, and are also going to relate to your self-presentation and focusing and developing more discernment of your identity and more of what your world view is, like more of your perception of life, more of your life philosophy is going to be fleshed out during this time. And then in the PDF I originally gave you, I also circled Jupiter here. And that's because Saturn in Pisces is not in rulership. So we've been talking about dispositors and rulerships during this reading, right? So Saturn in Pisces is what you would call a peregrine planet. So it means that its association is connected with a different planet. This planet is not in rulership. So Saturn's in rulership classically if it's in Aquarius or in Capricorn. But when it's not, we look to another planet to give us more insight. So Jupiter, which is in rulership, so it's in what we call its domicile. Jupiter is in Sagittarius. So Jupiter gets like rulership or lordship over Saturn here, because Jupiter in classical astrology rules Sagittarius and it rules Pisces. So Jupiter here is telling us more about this external relationship of the Saturn manifestations in your environment and in your life. So when Jupiter in the 12th house, which is the unconscious or the hidden self, or it's the house of self-undoing, there can be a relationship here that states that in some manner, a lot of how you form foundations in your life, or a lot of how you restrict yourself, or again, a lot of this understanding of yourself and self-evaluation comes from Jupiter in Sagittarius in the 12th house, which can mean that there is an unconscious element that needs to be delved into a little bit deeper. And when I see Jupiter in Sagittarius in the 12th house, there can be an impulsive instinct that crops up whenever this command of responsibility or accountability is like being summoned in your life, right? So there can be this sense of you wanting to evade some sense of responsibility or not wanting to face some of these heavier themes in your life. So you might sometimes tap into this unconscious desire of wanting to like not take things seriously, because that can be an element of Jupiter in Sagittarius, or always like looking at the bigger picture, or always trying to be like ultra optimistic about your prospects and not wanting to deal with things presently or in reality. And so sometimes you might brush off things that are serious, right? Or sometimes you may do a lot of good work in your life. Like you might you have like a conscious drive to want to improve. And so like you're very driven to create a life that's sustainable and create good foundations for yourself. But there might be an unconscious drive where you sabotage yourself at times, or there might be this unconscious yearning where like you kind of like you want to spend more of your time expanding your mindset and connecting spiritually, and the real world work isn't desirable, right? Or it doesn't intrigue you. If we go back to the modern chart casting where that Jupiter, Venus, Mars is in the 11th house, this can be that at times when you're trying to do something good for yourself and you're trying to like create a life for you that's sustainable, where you have physical and emotional security and you feel good about your prospects and you feel good about how you contribute, at times you may have outside influences that come in and they set you off track, or they distract you in some way. So you might at times have problems focusing, or have problems like with remaining consistent. And I can speak to this so strongly because I have Jupiter opposed Saturn, and that has been a lifelong theme of mine. Like I really struggle so hard with consistency on like any level, to the point where like it's a huge sore spot for me because it's connected to that Saturn, right? It's connected to Saturn. It's a heavy aspect to Saturn. And yeah, I mean, I have like broken down like sobbing in therapist's office because I get so frustrated with myself because every time I start to build something for myself, because I have Saturn on the midheaven, so I have Saturn like on the 10th house here. Every time I try to build something for myself, I have this like fear that's like linked to Jupiter where like I just like shortchange myself or I allow myself to get distracted, or what mine is linked to is like the houses of knowledge. So for me, every time like I want to like maybe like put myself out there in my career or my skill set, like a little voice comes up in my head and goes like, you're not good enough to do that. Like there's so many people out there that are more capable than you, that have more knowledge than you, that are more charming than you. So like, why even bother? Why don't you just stay in your little bubble where you're safe and you don't have to fear? So like, this is something I can speak to very strongly. If this relates with you, if you feel like this relates with you. Again, there are a few different ways we can interpret the external influences, but that's kind of speaking to generally how you look at the Saturn return. And you can see it as like two sides of the same coin. You have Saturn, your personal relationship with Saturn and its return, and then the ripple effects or the impact it makes at large, which because it's all centered in this first quadrant for the most part, minus this Jupiter, what this is saying is that your Saturn return is primarily impacting you. It is going through self-discovery all over again. And this actually started when Saturn first started transiting your ascendant. Like that's when a lot of that energy first came to be. So another thing that you can do is it could go back to go back to Placidus, right? Okay, so there we go. And then again, we can go to this natal transit. Previous time Saturn was on the, I think there is an ascendant here. Yeah. So just look at that. So yeah, Saturn was last on your ascendant in 2020, November of 2020. So that was sort of when you started to really maybe focus on this idea of self-development, self-discovery. So a lot of people discover astrology around this time, like if they, as they're seeking, because Saturn had just went through your 12th house of the unconscious and spirituality. So there are a lot of things that we purge around this time. We purge a lot, like we let go of a lot of things. We sacrifice and surrender a lot of things. And so Saturn is starting to rebuild after all that purging. And so oftentimes this is rebuilding the self-concept. And then as it goes through the second house, it starts to be this building of assets, money, how you make your income, or building of skills, right? Like building things that have valuation, that you can contribute some sort of valuation to. And this can also be building self-worth or building self-esteem. And oftentimes Saturn always comes through this lens of like limiting or constricting first, and then rebuilding and expanding like things that are more beneficial or things that are more lasting, because Saturn deals a lot with like concreteness or things that last. And so that is the arc of how Saturn is impacting your life. So hopefully that makes sense, and that gives you like a pretty good view of Saturn. And that I think that was a pretty good walkthrough. So if you have any more questions, and it got really dark in here, if you have any more questions, feel free to let me know. But I hope this was helpful, Idara, and let me know if you have any other questions after this, and I will do my best to respond. So thanks so much. Bye.